There are stories that don't want to be told. Not because they are too dark. Not because the words are hard to find. But because the person at the center of the story never asked to become a story in the first place. His name was Daniel, and by the time Margaret Hale understood what he truly was, it was almost too late for both of them. August in Mississippi doesn't arrive. It descends. It presses down on everything. The soil, the trees, the backs of people who have no choice but to stand beneath it. The air in Cypress Hollow smelled of cypress rot and standing water, of heat that had forgotten how to leave. Even the birds went quiet in the afternoon, as if sound itself was too exhausted to continue. Dr. Margaret Hale rode into town on a Tuesday, her medical bag strapped behind the saddle, her letter of commission folded in her coat pocket. She was 34 years old. She had graduated from the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania 6 years prior, one of 11 women in her class, and one of perhaps 3 who had been foolish enough, or stubborn enough, to actually practice medicine afterward. She had been sent to document fever cases in remote settlements. That was the official reason. The real reason was simpler. She was a woman, and the only postings available to women were the ones no one else wanted. She told herself she didn't mind. She had been telling herself that for 6 years. Something felt wrong the moment she entered Cypress Hollow, but she couldn't name it yet. She would spend a long time trying. The town was the kind of place that watched without turning its head. Curtains moved as she passed. Conversations stopped half a second too late to be natural. The woman at the boarding house, a Mrs. Clay, thin-lipped and careful, took Margaret's payment without offering her name, and showed her to a room without offering a smile. Only at supper did she speak. "You're here about the boy," she said. It wasn't a question. Margaret looked up from her plate. "I beg your pardon?" Mrs. Clay said nothing more. She refilled the water glass and walked back to the kitchen, and Margaret sat alone at the table with a sentence that had nowhere to go. She didn't know which boy. That detail matters. Remember it. Because every single person in that town already knew. Everyone except her. Sheriff Bo Wallace came to see her the following morning. He was a large man with the face of someone who had stopped being surprised by the world and started simply being afraid of it. He sat across from her in the boarding house parlor, held his hat in both hands, and was quiet for long enough that Margaret began to wonder if he'd forgotten why he came. "Dr. Hale," he finally said, "I'm not a superstitious man." He paused. "But there are things I cannot explain. And when I cannot explain something," he turned his hat slowly in his hands, "it keeps me up at night." He told her about the boy, 8 years old, enslaved on the Coleman plantation, 3 miles east of town. Small for his age, quiet, sickly-looking, though no one had ever been able to find a specific illness to treat. His name was Daniel Brooks. Margaret didn't know yet what that name would cost her. She simply took out her journal, uncapped her pen, and began to write. "He knows things," Wallace said quietly. "Things he has no business knowing. Things that happened before he was born." He looked at her then, directly, steadily, in a way that made her pen stop moving. "I need someone to tell me there's a rational explanation. I need that very badly, Doctor." Margaret looked down at the name she had just written. Daniel Brooks. She didn't answer the sheriff. Because something at the edge of her mind, small, unformed, not yet ready to be called a thought, told her that a rational explanation might not be what she was going to find. The Coleman plantation sat at the end of a road that didn't seem to want to be found. Margaret rode out the following morning with Sheriff Wallace beside her, and she noticed the way the trees changed as they moved east. The Spanish moss growing thicker, the light growing thinner, the road narrowing as if the land itself was suggesting they turn back. Wallace rode without speaking. His horse kept tossing its head. She would think about that later. The way animals always seemed to know before people did. Mr. Silas Coleman met them at the gate. He was a man of about 50, well-dressed in the way that men who want to appear important dress. Everything a size too formal for a Tuesday morning on a dirt road. He shook Wallace's hand and nodded at Margaret, with the particular expression men of his type reserved for women who had arrived somewhere unexpected. "Dr. Hale," he said, as though testing the words for a flaw. "Mr. Coleman," she replied, and gave him nothing more. He led them around the side of the main house, past a kitchen garden, past a well, toward a row of small wooden structures at the far edge of the property. He walked quickly and talked the whole way. About the heat, about the cotton, about a cousin in Natchez who had once met a female schoolteacher and found the experience thoroughly confusing. Margaret let him talk. She had learned long ago that men who filled silence usually did so because they were afraid of what silence might reveal. She was watching the spaces between his words. That was where the truth was hiding. They found Daniel sitting outside the last cabin in the row. He was small, smaller than she had expected for 8 years old, with thin wrists and careful eyes that moved across her face the way a person reads a document they're not sure they're allowed to read. He wore a shirt too large for his frame. His feet were bare in the dirt. He did not look afraid. That was the first thing that struck her. Every child she had ever encountered in a situation like this, brought before strangers, under scrutiny, on land that did not belong to them, looked afraid. It was a reasonable response. It was, in many ways, the only safe response. Daniel looked at her with something closer to patience, as if he had been waiting, as if he had known she was coming before she arrived. She told herself that was a projection, a doctor's habit of reading meaning into neutral expressions. She was wrong, but she wouldn't know that for another 3 days. Coleman spoke to the boy the way men like him always spoke to children they owned, loud, slow, with a performance of patience that had contempt underneath it, like water under ice. "Boy, this is the doctor from the city. She wants to ask you some questions. You answer her properly." Daniel looked at Coleman. Then he looked back at Margaret. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. Coleman nodded, satisfied, and stepped back. Margaret pulled a low stool from inside the cabin door and sat down so that she was level with the boy's eyes. She had always done this, sat at the height of the patient, not above them. Her first professor had called it good medicine. Most of her colleagues called it eccentric. She opened her journal. "Daniel," she said, "my name is Dr. Hale. I've come a long way. I was hoping we could talk." The boy studied her face for a moment. Then he said, perfectly calmly, "Your left hand aches in cold weather. You broke 2 fingers when you were young, and they didn't heal straight. You're right-handed, but you favor the left when you're tired. You're tired now." The scratch of Coleman's boot in the dirt behind her stopped. Wallace made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. Margaret looked down at her left hand, resting open on her journal. She had not mentioned it. She had not been rubbing it. She had not, as far as she was aware, favored it in any visible way since dismounting. She looked back at Daniel. His expression hadn't changed. Patient, quiet, waiting. "That's correct," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "How did you know that?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her, at the tree line, at the dark place where the plantation fields ended and the marsh began. "They told me," he said simply. "Who told you?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was so quiet she had to lean forward to hear it. "The ones that live in the water," he said. They talk at night, when it's quiet enough. Behind her, she heard Coleman shift his weight. She heard the particular sound of a man who wanted to say something dismissive and didn't quite dare. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Daniel, on this small boy with bare feet and careful eyes, and she wrote in her journal with a hand that was only slightly unsteady. He knew. He should not have known. I have no explanation yet. I intend to find one. She underlined the last sentence twice. She would not find one. Not the kind she was looking for. But that morning, sitting in the dirt outside a cabin on the Coleman plantation, she still believed that all things had rational explanations, that the world was a problem of sufficient complexity, and that a sufficiently careful person could solve it. It was the last morning she would believe that completely. She went back the next day, and the day after that. She told herself it was professional obligation. She told herself she was documenting an unusual case, a child of remarkable intelligence, possibly a savant, certainly worth recording for the medical literature. She wrote this in her journal each evening by lamplight, in her neat, careful hand, and each morning she rode east on the narrowing road toward the Coleman plantation and told herself she believed it. She didn't, entirely, but she wasn't ready to name what she believed instead. On the third day, Daniel was waiting for her at the gate, not at the cabin. At the gate, the far end of the long, dirt approach to the main house, a quarter-mile from where they had been meeting. He stood with his hands at his sides, looking down the road in her direction, and when she came close enough to see his face, she realized he had been standing there for some time. His feet were dusty to the ankle. "How long have you been here?" she asked, dismounting. "Since before the sun was fully up," he said. "Why?" He considered the question seriously, the way she was coming to understand he considered everything, not slowly, but with a completeness that made most adults look careless by comparison. "Because today is different," he said. She wanted to ask what he meant. She would learn, over time, that asking Daniel to explain his knowledge was like asking someone to explain how they recognized a face. The answer was always incomplete, always slightly beside the point. He knew what he knew, the way lungs know how to breathe. The mechanism was not available for inspection. What happened that morning would stay with her for the rest of her life. She just didn't know it yet. They walked together to a spot he had chosen, a place at the edge of the property where a large cypress tree had fallen years ago and made a kind of natural bench along a stretch of still water. He sat on the trunk. She sat beside him. She opened her journal. He began to talk. Not in the careful, measured way he spoke when Coleman or Wallace was nearby. He talked the way water moves when the channel opens, steady, unhurried, certain of its direction. He told her things. He told her that the water spoke to him in the hours before dawn, when the marsh was loudest and the rest of the world was quietest. He told her the voices were not frightening. They were old, he said, older than anything he could put a name to, and they did not wish him harm. They showed him things. Sometimes things that had already happened. Sometimes things that hadn't happened yet. Margaret wrote everything down. Her pen moved steadily. Her face, she hoped, remained neutral. Inside, something was pulling apart at the seams. "What kinds of things?" she asked. "What do they show you?" He was quiet for a moment. A bird called somewhere in the cypress canopy and fell silent. "They showed me my mother," he said. Margaret stopped writing. His voice didn't change. It stayed level, the way a river stays level, even over deep water. "She died when I was very small. I don't remember her face, but they showed it to me." He looked at the water. "She was teaching me letters, on wood," with charcoal. She said knowing letters was the most important thing a person could carry, because no one could take it away from you once it was inside you. Margaret thought about Sarah Brooks, a woman she had never met, who had died young on a plantation in Mississippi, who had secretly taught her son to read using charcoal on scraps of wood, and who had somehow managed to give him something that outlasted her own life. She thought about this, and she did not trust herself to speak for a moment. "She sounds remarkable," Margaret finally said. "She was," Daniel said simply. "They told me she was the bravest person on this plantation. They said it wasn't even close." There was a silence between them that felt oddly respectful, as though even the marsh had paused. Then Daniel turned and looked at her directly, the same steady, patient look he had given her that first day. "Dr. Hale," he said, "they told me something about you, too." She felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, exactly. Something adjacent to it. "Did they?" she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "They said you came here looking for something to explain." He tilted his head slightly. "But that's not really why you came. You came because you were tired of being somewhere you weren't wanted. And you thought a place this far away couldn't possibly make you feel more alone." The journal in her lap felt suddenly very heavy. She looked at this 8-year-old boy sitting on a fallen tree at the edge of a Mississippi marsh, barefoot, unhurried, watching her with eyes that seemed to hold considerably more years than his face did. "Is that wrong?" he asked, not unkindly. "No," she said after a long moment. "That's not wrong." He nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. She looked back at her journal, at the careful, professional sentences she had been writing for 3 days. Unusual cognitive presentation. Possible savant characteristics. Requires further documentation. She read those words and felt, for the first time, that they were laughably small. That whatever Daniel Brooks was, whatever moved through him, and spoke through him, and knew through him, it was not going to fit in her journal. Not even close. But she kept writing. Because it was the only tool she had. And because something told her, quietly, at the back of her mind, the way important things always announced themselves, that whatever was coming next, there needed to be a record. Someone needed to have written it down. It started with a name. Margaret was sitting with Daniel on the 7th day of her visits when he stopped mid-sentence, turned his head toward the marsh, and went very still. Not the stillness of a child distracted by something in the distance. Something deeper than that. The kind of stillness that has weight to it. She waited. She had learned to wait. After perhaps a full minute, he turned back to her. "Mr. Hargrove," he said quietly. "The man who runs the mill on Sycamore Road." Margaret looked up from her journal. "What about him?" Daniel looked at his hands in his lap. "He did something. To a boy named Thomas. 2 years ago. Thomas was 9. He paused. "Thomas isn't anywhere anymore." The air between them felt different after he said it. Thicker. Margaret's pen had stopped moving, without her deciding to stop it. "Daniel," she said carefully, "what do you mean Thomas isn't anywhere anymore?" The boy looked at her with those steady, ancient eyes. "I mean exactly that," he said. She wrote the name down. Thomas. She didn't know why. There was nothing yet to attach it to. No case, no record, no proof of anything. But her hand moved on its own, and she wrote it. And she underlined it once. She would think about that instinct later. It was the right one. She did not go to the sheriff immediately. She told herself she needed more information. She told herself she was a doctor not an investigator, and that the word of a child, an enslaved child, in Mississippi in 1858, would not be enough to move any official machinery, no matter what that child knew or didn't know. Both of these things were true. But there was another reason she waited, one she was slower to admit. She was afraid of what would happen to Daniel if the wrong people learned that he was the source. She had been in Cypress Hollow for 1 week. That was long enough to understand something about the architecture of the place. Who held power, who enforced it, who looked away, and who kept records of the looking away. It was a small town, which meant it had the particular cruelty of small towns. Everyone knew everything, and the knowing was arranged very carefully to protect certain people and expose others. Daniel was not one of the protected ones. He never had been. Something felt like it was tightening around him. She couldn't see it yet clearly, but she felt it. The way you feel a change in pressure before a storm arrives. 3 days later, Hargrove was found dead. He was discovered at the edge of his own mill pond on a Thursday morning, face down in 4 inches of water. The official explanation, delivered by the county doctor in under 20 minutes, was that he had suffered an episode of the heart and fallen. There were no marks on him. There was no sign of struggle. Margaret heard the news at breakfast from Mrs. Clay, who delivered it with the careful neutrality of a woman who had opinions she had decided not to have. Margaret sat very still over her coffee cup and thought about Daniel saying, "Thomas isn't anywhere anymore," and about the way he had looked at his hands afterward, as if the knowledge in them was something he hadn't chosen to carry. She went to see him that afternoon. He already knew about Hargrove. Of course he did. "Did you know this would happen?" she asked. She kept her voice even. She owed him that. He thought about the question seriously, in the way he always did. "I knew something would," he said. "They don't always show me the shape of it, just that something is unbalanced, and that balance has a way of finding itself." "Daniel," she leaned forward, "did you tell anyone else what you told me? About Hargrove? About Thomas?" He looked at her steadily. "No." "Are you certain?" "Dr. Hale," he said, with a patience that was almost unbearable. "Who would I tell?" She sat back. The question landed exactly where he had intended it to. He was 8 years old, enslaved, on a plantation 3 miles outside a town where no one with authority would listen to him about anything. He had told her. He had told her because she was, at that point, the only person who had ever sat down at his level and opened a journal and treated his words as something worth recording. She understood then the weight of what that was. She wasn't sure she had understood it fully before. There was a second name, then a third. A man named Pruitt, who owned a dry goods store on the main road and was known for settling disputes with his fists and his ledger book in approximately equal measure. Daniel mentioned him on a Wednesday, in the same quiet, sideways way, turning toward the marsh, going still, and then speaking the name like someone reading aloud from a document only he could see. "He took 3 children," Daniel said, "over 4 years. Sold them separately, far away, and kept the money himself. Told their families they'd been transferred to another county." He paused. "Their mothers still think they might come back." Margaret wrote it all down. Every word. She had stopped questioning the mechanism, stopped trying to find the rational explanation she had promised Sheriff Wallace she would look for. She wrote because the writing felt necessary, felt like the only act of justice available to her in a place where justice had a very selective address. Pruitt was found the following week, collapsed in his stockroom. Apoplexy, the county doctor said. Very sudden. No prior symptoms on record. Margaret read the report and sat with it for a long time. She was not a superstitious woman. She had trained in medicine precisely because she believed in causes and effects, in observable phenomena, in the accountability of the physical world. But she was also a scientist, which meant she believed in data. And the data, at this point, was becoming very difficult to dismiss. Two men, both named by Daniel, both dead within days, both connected, by Daniel's account, to children who had disappeared. She wrote in her journal that night, with a candle burning low beside her. I cannot explain the mechanism. I cannot verify the claims independently. I cannot prove causation. But I am beginning to believe that whatever moves through this boy is not random, and is not neutral, and is not finished. She paused. Then she added one more line. I am also beginning to believe that someone in this town is going to figure out where the names are coming from. And when they do, God help him. She found the letters on a Friday. Not letters in the postal sense, not correspondence, not documents. Letters of the alphabet. Carved into the underside of a loose floorboard in the cabin where Daniel slept. Small and precise and deliberate, the way a person writes when they know the writing itself is dangerous. Daniel had shown her. He had lifted the board without ceremony, the way a child shows an adult something they have been keeping for a long time and have finally decided to share. Underneath, in the soft wood, someone had carved the entire alphabet twice, once in capitals, once in lowercase, and below that, a single sentence. You are loved, and you are not forgotten. Margaret crouched in the dirt floor of the cabin and looked at those words for a long time without speaking. Your mother, she said finally. It wasn't a question. Before she got too sick to hold the nail, Daniel said. She said she wanted me to have something that would last longer than charcoal. Margaret pressed her fingers lightly against the carved letters. The wood was smooth at the edges, worn down by years of a small hand tracing the shapes in the dark. She had been a doctor for 6 years. She had seen a great deal of suffering in those 6 years, had learned to hold it at the clinical distance that the profession required. But there were moments that got through anyway. Moments that found the gap between the professional and the human and walked straight through it. This was one of those moments. She didn't write anything in her journal for several minutes. She just knelt in the dirt of that cabin and breathed. Sarah Brooks had died 3 years before Margaret arrived in Cypress Hollow. Margaret pieced together what she could from conversations. Careful, indirect conversations, because asking direct questions about the dead on a plantation was the kind of thing that made people go quiet in ways that were hard to recover from. She spoke to an older woman named Cora, who had known Sarah well, who agreed to talk to her one afternoon near the kitchen garden while she worked, without looking up from her hands. Sarah had been, by every account, extraordinary. Not in the way that stories sometimes make the dead extraordinary, inflated by grief and distance into something mythological. Extraordinary in specific, particular ways that the people who knew her remembered with the precision of people who had paid close attention. She had memorized the names and faces of every child sold away from the plantation in the 12 years she was there. Memorized them and recited them, quietly, at night, so they would not be forgotten. She had known plants, which ones reduced fever, which ones eased pain, which ones needed to be avoided. Knowledge she had gathered carefully over years and shared without hesitation. She had been, in ways that left no official record, a kind of doctor herself. And she had taught her son to read, in secret, at enormous risk, using charcoal on wood scraps, and then a nail on a floorboard, and then, when she was too sick to hold anything, her voice alone, running him through letters and sounds in the dark until she didn't have breath left to continue. She knew she was dying, Cora said, still not looking up from her work. She said the most important thing was that he carry something they couldn't take. She spent her last good months making sure he had it. Margaret walked back to the boarding house that evening in the long, low light of a Mississippi afternoon, and thought about what it meant to love someone that completely. To use your last strength not to hold on, but to give. She thought about Daniel tracing those carved letters in the dark, alone in a cabin, keeping his mother alive, the only way left to him. Something had been shifting in her since she arrived in Cypress Hollow. She hadn't named it yet. She was close now. It was Cora who first said the word that everyone else had been carefully not saying. Margaret had been about to leave the garden when the older woman spoke again, quietly, without changing her posture, in the way that important things were communicated in places where walls had ears. "You know what they say about him," Cora said. "The people here. Not the white folks." She paused. "Our people." "Tell me," Margaret said. Cora was quiet for a moment, her hands still moving. "They say his mother didn't just leave him letters," she said. "They say she left him something else. Something she carried from her mother, who carried it from hers, going back further than anyone can name." She glanced up briefly, then back down. "They say when Sarah died, she didn't go all the way, that she stayed close, that she and the others, all the ones lost on this land, they found the boy and they stayed." Margaret stood very still. "They say he's not talking to spirits," Cora continued. "They say he's talking to family." The kitchen garden was very quiet. Somewhere in the distance, the marsh made its low, constant sound, that hiss and murmur that Margaret had grown so accustomed to she'd stopped hearing it consciously. Now she heard it again. She thought about Daniel turning toward the tree line, going still, listening. She thought about his voice when he spoke of his mother. "They told me she was the bravest person on this plantation. They said it wasn't even close." Not past tense in the way of memory, present tense in the way of contact. She walked back to the boarding house and sat at the small desk in her room and opened her journal to a fresh page. She held her pen over the paper for a long time. Then she wrote, "I came here looking for a rational explanation. I have been here 4 weeks. I have been thorough, and I have been careful, and I have applied every framework I was trained to apply." She stopped, started again. "I no longer believe the explanation I am looking for is the one I came here prepared to find." She closed the journal. Outside, the sun was going down over the bayou, turning the water copper, and then red, and then the deep, lightless color of something that has decided to keep its secrets. The marsh made its sound. The cypress trees stood in the water like sentinels. Somewhere 3 miles east, in a cabin with letters carved into a floorboard, an 8-year-old boy was listening to voices that had no intention of going quiet. And for the first time since she arrived in Mississippi, Margaret Hale was not trying to explain them away. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like the moment before something breaks. She didn't sleep well that night. She wouldn't sleep well for a long time after. His name was Caldwell, Roy Caldwell. He was the overseer at the Coleman plantation, had been for 11 years, which in that place and time meant he had accumulated 11 years of small powers and smaller cruelties, layered one on top of the other, until they had become, for him, simply the texture of daily life. He was not a remarkable man. That was perhaps the most frightening thing about him. He was exactly ordinary, in exactly the way that made ordinary dangerous. Margaret had seen him on her visits, passing at a distance, watching from doorways. He never approached her directly. He never spoke to her. But she felt his attention, the way you feel a change in temperature. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, until you realize you have been cold for some time. She should have paid closer attention to that feeling earlier. She knew that now. The morning it changed began like the others. She rode out to the plantation, tied her horse at the gate, walked the familiar path toward the fallen cypress at the edge of the marsh. The air was thick and close, the way it got before afternoon storms. The Spanish moss hung completely still. Daniel was not at their usual spot. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. She told herself he had been delayed. By work, by Coleman, by any of the dozen ordinary obstacles that structured every hour of his day. She opened her journal and reviewed her notes from the previous session and told herself she was not worried. She was worried. After 20 minutes, she walked toward the cabins, and that was when she saw Caldwell, standing in the open space between the main house and the quarters, with Daniel beside him, not touching him, just standing close enough that the proximity was its own kind of statement. Caldwell looked at her as she approached. His expression was the expression of a man who has made a decision and is waiting to see if anyone will challenge it. "Dr. Hale," he said, "I was just telling the boy that your visits are going to be concluding." Margaret stopped walking. She kept her face still. "I wasn't aware that was your decision to make," she said. "My arrangement is with Mr. Coleman." "Mr. Coleman's arrangements are my business," Caldwell said. "That's what an overseer is." He said the word overseer the way some men say their own name, with a satisfaction that revealed exactly how much of their identity lived inside it. Margaret looked at Daniel. He was looking at the ground. His face was composed, too composed, with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that showing fear makes things worse. Something moved through her then. Not quite anger, something older than anger. "Daniel," she said clearly, "look at me." He raised his eyes. "I'll speak with Mr. Coleman this morning," she said, "directly." Caldwell made a sound, not quite a laugh. "You're welcome to." She held Daniel's gaze for one more moment. Long enough, she hoped, to say what she couldn't say aloud. "I see you. I am not leaving." Then she turned and walked toward the main house. She did not look back at Caldwell. She would not give him that. Coleman received her in his study, a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old ledgers, the smell of a man who had confused record-keeping with righteousness. He was polite. He was always polite. Politeness, she had come to understand, was the particular armor of men who did terrible things in orderly ways. He told her, with great courtesy, that her visits to Daniel would need to be limited going forward. The boy had work obligations, he explained. The documentation project, while admirable, was creating disruptions to the routine of the property. "The disruption," Margaret said carefully, "is a few hours a week." "In this kind of operation," Coleman said, "routine is everything." She looked at him across the desk, at the ledgers on the shelf behind him, at the careful, comfortable arrangement of a life built on the labor of people who had no say in the building. She thought about Sarah Brooks spending her last months carving letters into a floorboard. She thought about Cora's hands moving steadily in the garden, not looking up. She thought about Thomas, whose name she had written and underlined and still could not verify through any official channel. "I understand," she said, because it was the only thing she could say that would let her stay in the room long enough to think. She left without the concession she'd come for, but she had learned something more useful. She had seen, in Coleman's polite, implacable face, that Caldwell had already spoken to him before she arrived. The conversation she had walked into had already been arranged. They had been watching Daniel more carefully than she realized, and now they were beginning to watch her. She was halfway down the plantation road when she heard feet on the dirt behind her. She turned. It was Daniel, running, which she had almost never seen him do, his too large shirt billowing, his bare feet raising small clouds of dust. He stopped a few feet away and bent forward to catch his breath. "Daniel, he's going to sell me," he said. Not frantically, not crying, just stating it, the way he stated everything, with that terrible calm that broke her heart a little more each time she encountered it. "Caldwell," she said. He nodded. "He told Mr. Coleman I was causing trouble, that I was—" He paused, seeming to search for the exact word Caldwell had used. "Unsettling the other workers. That a boy who says the things I say is bad for the order of the place." He straightened up and looked at her. "They showed me last night," he said. "A man on a road, a wagon. I'm in it." His voice was absolutely level. "I don't know where the road goes." Margaret stood on the dirt road in the heavy morning air and felt something crystallize inside her. Some decision that had been forming for weeks without her fully acknowledging it, taking its final shape now in the space of a few seconds. "When?" she asked. "Soon," he said. "They don't always show me the exact time. But the feeling is—" He paused. "Close." She crouched down so she was level with his eyes. She had always done this. She did it now because it seemed important, because she wanted him to see her face clearly, and she wanted to see his. "Daniel," she said, "I need you to trust me." He looked at her steadily. "I already do," he said. "That's why I ran." She stood. She looked back at the plantation, at the main house visible through the trees, at the thin smoke rising from the kitchen, at the place that had been his entire world and that was already, she understood, preparing to discard him. She began to think, quickly, carefully, the way she thought through a difficult diagnosis, ruling out what wouldn't work, isolating what might, moving toward the only available course of action, with the particular focus of someone who knows that time has become a factor. She had contacts in New Orleans. 2 of them, at least, she trusted. And she had heard, carefully, in the right company, in the right tone, about routes north, about people who moved other people through darkness toward something better. She had never thought she would need that information herself. She had been wrong about that, too. 4 days later, Roy Caldwell arranged the sale. A traveling trader named Hicks came through Cypress Hollow on his way north. A broad, loud man with a wagon full of dry goods and, by private arrangement, an interest in acquiring additional human cargo for markets further up the Mississippi Valley. The transaction was conducted in Coleman's study, in the language of ledgers and livestock, in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. Daniel was brought to the wagon the following morning. Margaret was not there. She had not been permitted to come. She heard about it afterward from Cora, who had watched from the kitchen doorway, who told her in a voice stripped down to its essential facts, because the feelings attached to those facts were too large to carry in words. She heard about it, and she sat very still, and she thought about a boy with careful eyes and bare feet, sitting in a wagon on a road that went somewhere he couldn't see. She thought about what he had told her. A man on a road, a wagon, I'm in it. And then she thought about what he had not told her, what she only learned 3 days later, when a rider came into Cypress Hollow with news from the road north. The trader Hicks had collapsed on the 2nd day of travel. Suddenly, without warning, in the middle of a flat, open stretch of road with no particular cause anyone could name. By the time help arrived, he was gone. Daniel had been found sitting calmly beside the wagon, waiting. Margaret received this news at the boarding house breakfast table. Mrs. Clay told her, with the same careful neutrality she brought to all difficult information. Margaret picked up her coffee cup and set it down without drinking, and looked out the window at the street. She thought about balance, finding itself, about things unfinished, demanding to be finished. She thought about the words carved into a floorboard in a dark cabin. You are loved and you are not forgotten. And she thought, neither is Thomas. Neither is any of them. Then she stood up from the table, went to her room, and began writing the most important letter of her life. He came to her door on a Tuesday evening, just before dark. No wagon this time, no overseer. No one with legal claim to him, standing close enough to make proximity its own kind of threat. Just Daniel, small, dusty, carrying nothing, standing on the step of the Cypress Hollow boarding house, as if he had always known this was where he would end up. She opened the door and looked at him for a long moment. "Come in," she said. He did. She had questions, 100 of them, about the road, about Hicks, about the 2 days between the trader's death and his arrival at her door. She asked none of them that night. Some things needed food and rest before they needed explanation. She fed him. She made up the narrow cot in the corner of her room. She sat at her desk while he slept and listened to the sounds of the town settling into night, and she understood, with the clarity that comes only when a decision has already been made, that everything was different now. He was here, and she was responsible. She opened her journal and wrote 4 words: I will not fail him. Then she began to plan. The secrets came faster now. With Daniel no longer on the plantation, no longer visible, no longer contained, something seemed to loosen in him. The voices, he told her, were louder in the boarding house, closer, as if the distance from that land had cleared some interference she hadn't known was there. He told her things that kept her awake long after he slept. Names of children sold and scattered across 3 states. Locations of things buried, money, documents, evidence of transactions that powerful men had paid considerable sums to make disappear. He spoke quietly, methodically, the way her best professors had lectured. No drama, no embellishment, just information delivered with the confidence of someone reading from a source others couldn't access. She wrote everything down, every word, every name. She was building something, she realized, not just a medical record, a testimony, a document that could outlast both of them if it needed to. Something told her it might need to. Outside, Cypress Hollow was beginning to ask questions about where the boy had gone. She could feel it, the way pressure builds before something gives. They were running out of time. She didn't tell Daniel. He already knew. They came on a Thursday, 3 men, Caldwell and 2 others she didn't recognize, which somehow made it worse. She heard them from upstairs, heavy boots on the boarding house porch, voices with the particular confidence of men who have never had to knock and wait. Mrs. Clay's voice below, careful, neutral, buying seconds that felt like nothing and everything simultaneously. Margaret turned to Daniel. He was already standing, already calm, as if Thursday had been marked somewhere only he could see. The back window, she said quietly, the elm tree, down to the kitchen roof, then the ground. Can you do that? He looked at her with those steady eyes. Yes, he said, but Dr. Hale. Go. They're not just looking for me, he said. They've read enough to be afraid of what you've written down. She felt something cold move through her chest. Her journal, her testimony. She grabbed it from the desk and pressed it into his hands. Then take it, she said. Keep it safe. He held the journal against his chest and looked at her. One long, clear look that contained something she couldn't fully name. Gratitude, yes. but something older than gratitude. Then he went to the window, and he was gone. Below, the boots kept coming. She never saw him again, not in Cypress Hollow, not anywhere she could name with certainty. But she heard about him. That was the thing about Daniel Brooks. He didn't disappear the way people in his position were supposed to disappear. Quietly, completely, absorbed into the silence that swallowed so many. He left traces, rumors that traveled faster than he did, arriving in cities before he reached them, waiting for him like old friends. A young man in Cincinnati who helped locate 3 missing children simply by walking the streets and listening. A figure in Philadelphia who appeared at the door of an abolitionist safe house with documents, specific, detailed, damning documents, describing illegal transactions involving prominent men in Mississippi. No one knew how he had obtained them. She heard these stories, and she recognized him in every one. The quietness, the patience, the knowledge that had no visible source. She thought about him on the last night she spent in Cypress Hollow, sitting at the small desk in her room, her journal gone, her hands empty, listening to the marsh making its ancient sound through the open window. She thought about a floorboard with letters carved into it, about a woman who used her last strength to give her son something they couldn't take, about a boy who sat beside a dead man's wagon on an empty road and waited, calm as still water, because he already knew someone was coming. She thought about what Cora had told her in the kitchen garden. They say he's not talking to spirits. They say he's talking to family. And she thought, not for the first time, not for the last, that perhaps those two things were not so different. That perhaps what moved through Daniel was simply love in its most concentrated and enduring form. The love of people who had been stripped of everything else and had chosen, stubbornly, magnificently, to leave this behind. A voice, a knowing, a refusal to be silent. There is something I want to say directly, not as narrator, but as the person who spent 2 years reconstructing this story from fragments. From Margaret Hale's surviving letters, from courthouse records, from the oral histories of families in Mississippi and Ohio and Pennsylvania who carried pieces of this in their memories without knowing they were connected. I don't know what Daniel Brooks was. I don't think that question has a clean answer. And I'm not sure clean answers are what this story is for. What I know is what he did. He remembered the forgotten. He named the unnamed. He carried, in whatever way he carried it, the weight of people who had no other advocate in a world that had deliberately, systematically decided they didn't matter. That feels important to say out loud. Now, specifically, in this specific moment. If this story moved something in you, if Daniel stayed with you the way he stayed with me, I want to ask you something. Leave a comment below with the word Daniel. Just that. No explanation needed. I want to see how many of us he reached. And if you want to know about the other voices history tried to silence, the other children, the other impossible knowers, the other people who carried light into places designed to extinguish it, subscribe. Because there are more stories like this one. There always have been. We just haven't been telling them loudly enough. Margaret Hale left Cypress Hollow on a Saturday morning in October 1858. She rode out the same way she had ridden in, alone, her medical bag strapped behind the saddle, except that she was not the same person who had arrived. She continued practicing medicine. She continued keeping journals. She spent the remaining 30 years of her life documenting cases that her colleagues found embarrassing and her patients found life-saving. And she never once apologized for the combination. She never wrote about Daniel publicly. She understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has learned exactly how the world works, that to name him was to endanger him. So she kept him in the private journals, in the careful, precise handwriting that had recorded everything he said, everything he knew, everything he was. Those journals survived her. They found their way, through a chain of hands I spent a long time tracing, to a library in Philadelphia, where they sat in an archive box for 60 years before anyone thought to look. I looked, and here we are. Somewhere out there, in Cincinnati, in Philadelphia, in small towns along the routes that freedom traveled in 1858 and beyond, there are people who are descended from children Daniel helped find, who exist because a boy listened to voices no one else could hear, and a woman wrote down what he said, and together they did the only thing available to them. They refused to let the silence win. I think about that on difficult days. I think about Daniel sitting on a fallen cypress tree at the edge of a Mississippi marsh, barefoot, patient, listening to something ancient and necessary moving through the water. I think about what it means to carry a voice that isn't only yours. And I think, every single time, that it's enough, that it has always been enough, that love, stubborn and specific and refused to be extinguished, is the oldest and most powerful thing in the world. Daniel knew that. His mother taught him. In the end, that's the whole story.